Hi, this is Pastor Steve at Kerwinsville Alliance. I'm going to talk to you about that anxiety that you're feeling. I want to talk to you about maybe some places it's coming from, and I think it's coming from how our society is working these days. A good friend of mine sent me an article written by David Brooks concerning the issue of trust in our society. It's 24 pages long. I saved it as a PDF. I'm not going to ask you to read it. I'm just going to share with you some information from it. Let me give you some statistics on trust. First, in 1964, 77% of Americans said, "I think we can trust the federal government." 30 years later, that number had dropped to 20%. In other words, it went from almost 4 out of 5 people to 1994, it was 1 out of 5 people said, "I think we can trust the federal government." I wonder what that number is at today. In 1997, that's right, 1997, 64% of Americans said, I may not believe or agree with everybody politically speaking, but I would say most of my fellow Americans are pretty smart politically. 64% said that. What's that number look like today? Well, it's cut almost in half. 33% today say, "I think my fellow Americans are pretty smart politically speaking." Let me just read this part to you. Brooks says in 2012, so frame that in history, 40% of baby boomers believed that most people could be trusted. 31% of Generation X believed the same thing. In contrast, only 19% of millennials said most people could be trusted, and 73% of adults under 30 believe that most of the time people just look out for themselves. And it says 71% of those young adults say that most people would take advantage of you if they had a chance. Are you beginning to see that trust is an issue in our society, that we have a problem trusting one another? That trust shows up in real practical ways. Like when money's tight, you might have at one time wanted to trust your employer, like, I know money's tight, but he's not going to just fire me. Now, it's a little harder to trust. And the employer himself, he might have trouble trusting his employees. It shows up in places like the grocery store. I got some spam today in my email, and it said, "Who's been touching the groceries at your grocery store? Who's been picking those things up and looking at them before you touch them?" And you know what they're getting at, right? And then they said, "Trust us. We will send you groceries that are pure and untouched." They're capitalizing on what they see as a lack of trust in our society. Wow. And inside of Christendom, it breaks my heart that recently one of my heroes has been accused of inappropriate behavior. As a leader, as a Christian leader, I'd like to say he's the first, but he's just another in a long line. And so trust is something that is hard to do. Now, you may think to yourself, how do we fix this issue of trust in our society? Maybe we should just begin trusting people willy-nilly, and that would be very foolish, right? That would not be a good idea at all. Maybe you're thinking, hey, the way to deal with the trustworthy problem is to become trustworthy people. And now you're onto something that has huge implications for my business. That Christians, that the church, that ministries should work hard to be above reproach. But let me just get to where you're at for a minute. And let me talk to you about how you can manage this sense of distrust that you're experiencing, that you're feeling. And I would say that the way to manage it is maybe to look at who you can trust. Who can you trust? The psalmist writes in Psalm 20, verse 7, "Some trust in chariots and in horses." And by the way, in that era, that was the government. Some trust in chariots and horses. They belong to the government. But we trust in the name of the Lord our God. The author of Proverbs in chapter 3 says, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Don't lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him." That's what you do when you trust him, is you follow him, and he will direct your paths. He'll make your paths straight. Trust him. In fact, you can trust him in the worst of times. It was Jeremiah who wrote the book of Lamentations, or so we understand. And in the midst of that terrible time in the nation of Israel, Jeremiah penned these words: "Because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness." He's trusting God. Now look, when you begin to consciously choose to trust God, then issues with the government and issues with your finances and issues with who's been handling my groceries, those things become less significant in your heart. And your anxiety level that has maybe been up here, as you trust the Lord, as you choose to trust him, that anxiety level goes down and those worries abate because you're resting in him. I would encourage you to examine how intentional you are being about trusting God. I would encourage you to cast all your worries on him because you know that he cares for you. I'm Steve Shields. I'm the pastor at Kernersville Alliance, and I hope you have a blessed day as you choose to trust the Lord.